Imagine a world where an empire once stretched across 3 continents. Its armies feared, its culture admired, and its power seemingly eternal. Yet, in the shadows of glory, cracks began to form, whispers of rebellion, foreign pressures, and leaders torn between tradition and reform. This is the untold journey of the Ottoman Empire, its rise, brilliance, struggles, and ultimate fall. A story of ambition, betrayal, resilience, and the relentless tides of history. In 1932, the Japanese High Command reacted to the rapes carried out by its soldiers not with punishment, but with strategic planning. Instead of prevention, they organized. And rather than condemning, they established a vast system of state-controlled sexual enslavement. Thus emerged the comfort stations, a logistical mechanism as deliberately designed as any other component of the imperial war machine. Thousands of women were seized, rotated, inspected, and abused with bureaucratic accuracy. Korean, Chinese, Filipino, and Indonesian women were chosen according to age, fertility, and physical endurance. They were moved along military routes, subjected to continual medical supervision, and used as instruments for discipline, morale, and disease prevention among the troops. How could such a system of this scale be concealed? Why were the architects of this machinery never brought to justice? And how did Japan succeed in erasing almost all official records of this state policy of sexual enslavement for decades? Sexual politics, the origin of the Japanese comfort system. In October 1931, reports from the Kempeitai began reaching the Japanese High Command, raising increasing alarm. Occupation forces in Manchuria were committing mass rapes of civilian women, creating a problem that went beyond immediate military discipline. The files of the Manchurian Garrison Army headquarters documented more than 200 recorded incidents between October and December of that year, a figure alarming not for humanitarian reasons, but for its operational consequences. The Manchurian territory, transformed into the puppet state of Manchu Kuo, had become a testing ground for the empire's new doctrines of total war. Military planners observed that these assaults undermined 3 essential foundations of effective occupation: the discipline within the army, the health of the soldiers, and the morale required to sustain prolonged campaigns. The first threat was disciplinary. Violations represented acts of disobedience that weakened the military's chain of command. Local officers reported increasing struggles to preserve order among soldiers acting without authorization, jeopardizing the operational performance of entire units. The second issue was medical. Between 1931 and 1933, field hospitals in Manchuria recorded more than 40,000 cases of syphilis, gonorrhea, and chancroid among troops, turning medical leave into a serious tactical weakness. The third threat was psychological. The Imperial Army envisioned occupations lasting for decades, requiring mechanisms to prevent the emotional breakdown of soldiers under relentless stress in hostile regions. Military epidemiologists warned that the mixture of rampant sexual violence, venereal disease, and declining morale could gravely endanger Japan's capacity to maintain effective control over its conquests. The High Command solution was groundbreaking in its calculated ruthlessness. Instead of merely punishing individual acts of sexual assault, military strategists opted to institutionalize and regulate the sexual conduct of their soldiers by establishing specialized facilities. The first concrete trial was carried out in Shanghai during the armed clashes that followed the January 28th incident of 1932. This heavily populated metropolitan environment posed particular dangers. The close presence of the Chinese civilian population, the scrutiny of international observers, and the necessity of projecting an image of military discipline to the outside world. The headquarters of the Expeditionary Forces ordered the creation of licensed and regulated sexual facilities managed by civilians, but placed under the direct oversight of the military police. The original design of the Shanghai system contained features that would later become standard elements of the model: compulsory registration of women, routine medical examinations supervised by Army personnel, health cards documenting medical condition, and a token system that soldiers used to access services at scheduled intervals. This logistical framework aimed to achieve several specific goals: preventing overcrowding that might provoke conflicts among soldiers, keeping precise records of who utilized the facilities, imposing health controls to reduce the spread of infection, and introducing a reward mechanism that could be used to encourage desired conduct within the ranks. The outcomes of the Shanghai experiment were carefully analyzed by the High Command. Officers' reports noted a marked decrease in disciplinary problems connected to sexual behavior and a significant drop in the number of sexually transmitted infections recorded at field hospitals. Equally emphasized was the psychological effect. Soldiers demonstrated improved emotional steadiness and fewer instances of erratic conduct or desertion. This perceived success prompted the rapid standardization of the model and its extension to other key urban centers. In 1933, comparable establishments were set up in Dalian, Qingdao, Nanjing, and later Beijing. Each new station incorporated refinements drawn from experience: enhanced record-keeping, stricter medical protocols, and facilities designed specifically to optimize operational effectiveness. The transformation from a localized tactical measure to a formal national military policy occurred in 1934, when the Ministry of the Army issued a series of directives establishing mandatory minimum standards for all comfort stations. These orders, signed by General Hajime Sugiyama, the future Minister of War, detailed everything from architectural requirements to medical procedures, including the minimum number of beds per facility, ventilation and sanitation standards, the types of prophylactic medicines that had to be supplied, the frequency of medical inspections, and the rules for the registration and rotation of women. Definitive institutionalization took place when the Army General Staff formally integrated comfort stations into the standard logistical planning for deployment operations. Starting in 1935, every regiment was required to ensure access to at least one functioning facility within its operational zone, treating such services as a vital logistical element on par with food, ammunition, or medical provisions. The Operations Manual for Extended Campaigns, a classified document for 1936, made explicit references to comfort stations as tools for indirect psychological control and maintaining combat readiness. The manual stated that the presence of locations for soldiers' relaxation and physical upkeep guaranteed continuous discipline and reduced operational exhaustion in long-term hostile environments. The system also fulfilled a crucial internal propaganda purpose. Reports from the Ministry of Propaganda in 1936 and 1937 described these facilities as tangible proof of the High Command's concern for the welfare of ordinary soldiers, strengthening the image of modernity, discipline, and scientific planning that the Imperial Army sought to project to its own troops and to Japanese society. Financial directives issued in 1935 allocated dedicated budgets for the upkeep, medical inspections, and rotation of women, embedding permanent expenditures within the Army's fiscal system. This process included the establishment of specific bureaucratic posts tasked with overseeing the sexual and medical welfare of soldiers in combat zones, positions that became officially integrated into the administrative framework of the Imperial Army. By 1937, with the outbreak of full-scale war against China, the system had evolved from an improvised solution in Shanghai into a comprehensive national policy, reinforced by regulations, assigned budgets, permanent administrative bodies, and military doctrines that treated it as an indispensable element of modern warfare. The comfort women system had emerged as a deliberately engineered instrument of total war, created to sustain prolonged occupations through the systematic regulation of soldier sexuality. Military brothels, the hidden apparatus of the Imperial Army. The operational effectiveness of the comfort women system rested on its strict military organization, which transformed sexual exploitation into a logistical mechanism as complex and meticulous as any other support service of the Imperial Army. This framework did not arise haphazardly from the disorder of war, but was consciously engineered with the same technical precision applied to the provisioning of weapons, rations, or battlefield medical care. The system functioned through four principal categories of facilities, each adapted to specific operational requirements and the varying conditions of different theaters of war. Permanent stations and occupied zones were established in strategically significant cities such as Nanjing, Seoul, Dalian, Saigon, Rabaul, and Batavia. These fixed installations featured durable structures, individual rooms outfitted to military specifications, designated medical spaces equipped with basic surgical instruments, and administrative offices for supervisory personnel. Their operation fell directly under the jurisdiction of military logistics departments, with staff formally incorporated into the Army's bureaucratic chain of command. Mobile combat stations represented the system's adaptation to the fluid realities of frontline conditions. Positioned near active battle lines, these stations operated out of fortified military tents, portable barracks assembled from prefabricated materials, or specially modified trucks with internal compartments. They advanced alongside combat troops, following the course of operations, and functioned on accelerated rotations to maximize usage during short windows of availability. Their upkeep and transportation were entrusted to quartermaster units, which treated them as specialized military assets subject to the same mobilization and maintenance protocols as weapons or vehicles. Temporary transit stations were created during occupation campaigns or along heavily trafficked military routes. Positioned strategically at rail hubs, port installations, or key road junctions, these facilities remained active for durations ranging from several days to a few weeks, depending on troop movements and the progress of military campaigns. Their setup demanded complex logistical coordination to align the availability of women with the schedules of units passing through. Mixed or replenishment facilities combined multiple functions into a unified recovery model. These centers provided soldiers returning from the front not only with sexual services, but also with physical rest and specialized medical care. Typically located in safer rear areas, such as Korea or Formosa, they operated as comprehensive recovery complexes designed to restore both the physical stamina and psychological stability of troops before their reassignment to fresh combat duties. Each type of facility was governed by detailed operational manuals issued by the Morale Division of the General Staff. These documents outlined everything from structural requirements to protocols dictating interactions between soldiers and women. The degree of standardization was so absolute that an officer transferred from a station in mainland China to one in the Philippines would encounter identical procedures. The same forms, the same schedules, the same metrics for evaluating efficiency. The day-to-day management of the stations adhered to rigid military timetables that controlled every aspect of activity. The women were categorized according to strict criteria such as age, physical health, prior experience within the system, and evaluations of docility or potential resistance. This information was thoroughly documented on personal cards that included photographs, full medical histories, service logs, periodic performance reviews, and notes on demeanor towards supervisory staff. Operating hours varied with the size of the local garrison, but generally ran from 9 a.m. until late at night, with women's limited rest periods timed to coincide with soldiers' meal breaks. During active campaigns, hours were frequently extended to accommodate heightened demand before soldiers embarked on hazardous missions. Access for soldiers was regulated through numbered cards recording their identity, rank, unit, entry time, and service duration. These cards were collected daily by clerical staff and audited monthly by specialized inspectors who assessed a wide range of operational metrics. The total number of encounters per period, average session length, demand distribution across ranks, requests for related medical care, and the utilization rates of prophylactic supplies issued through the system. Health surveillance formed a central and highly developed component of the system. Women were subjected to compulsory gynecological examinations every 3 to 5 days. Procedures were overseen by military physicians who carefully documented the results on individual health cards. These records contained detailed notes on overall health condition, presence or absence of infections, treatments administered, responses to medications, and assessments regarding future operational capacity. The identification of any infection resulted in the immediate isolation of the woman concerned and her substitution with another sent from replenishment centers, guaranteeing the uninterrupted functioning of the system while minimizing health risks to the troops. The doctors assigned to the stations were not auxiliary or temporary personnel, but integral, permanent components of the system. At the fixed stations, each facility maintained at least one garrison physician trained specifically in tropical medicine and venereal diseases, supported by nursing staff with basic gynecological training and assured access to standardized military medical kits. These kits included minor surgical instruments, antibiotics, suture materials, and supplies for the treatment of sexually transmitted infections. Reports generated by these medical teams were automatically incorporated into each regiment's monthly logistics file, treating the health and operational capacity of women as another category of specialized military resources. The reports recorded morbidity rates, effectiveness of treatments, projections of personnel availability, and recommendations to improve health procedures. Condom distribution formed an essential element of the regular military supply chain, managed by the same quartermaster units responsible for issuing uniforms, food, and medicines. Each station typically received between 1,200 and 2,000 condoms weekly during normal conditions, with numbers rising sharply during campaigns or periods of heavy demand. Deliveries were logged using official forms stamped by quartermaster staff, while medical personnel directly supervised distribution as part of routine preventive protocols. When supply lines collapsed under systematic attacks by American submarines targeting Japanese merchant shipping, emergency measures were enacted. Condoms were washed, disinfected, and reused until material degradation rendered them unusable. This adaptation in conditions of scarcity revealed the priority the system maintained even under extreme wartime strain. The transfer of women between stations functioned like any other sophisticated military logistics operation, coordinated by the Army's Logistics Division using designated railway and naval routes. Military trains included modified cars with separate compartments for group transport, improved ventilation, and rudimentary sanitary facilities. Women traveled under guard, accompanied by armed escorts and medical staff tasked with maintaining their condition during journeys lasting several days. Maritime routes linked the principal operational hubs from Seoul to Rangoon using requisitioned civilian vessels placed under direct military authority. These ships were protected by destroyers in active war zones, with schedules synchronized to troop and supply movements to maximize efficiency. Embarkation records listed exhaustive details: the exact number of women transported, their assigned destination, departure time and date, the escort personnel with names and ranks, certified medical status, and an inventory of food and medical supplies for the voyage. These records were automatically cross-checked with medical files at the receiving station to guarantee traceability and immediate integration of the transported women into local operations. Financially, each station functioned as an autonomous fiscal unit with its own revenue stream, subject to systematic audits by specialized Army accountants. Payments made by soldiers were not handed directly to the women, but collected by the officer in charge and recorded in official ledgers, following the same bookkeeping procedures used for other revenue-generating functions of the military. Rates were regionally standardized according to official tables, differentiated by user rank, duration of service, and type of facility. A documented 1938 tariff system fixed prices in Sun and Yen. 1 yen for 30 minutes of basic service, 1.5 yen for 1 hour, and up to 3 yen for private sessions reserved for senior officers. These tariffs incorporated all operational expenses, medical supplies, women's rations, lodging, transportation, and administrative costs for supervising staff. While the women were allocated a monetary allowance formally recorded as wages, this sum amounted to only a negligible fraction of the total revenue generated by each station. Living costs and medical expenses were deducted according to standardized tables, further reducing what remained for the women themselves. Transportation expenses from the central office, along with a broad category termed administrative services, which encompass supervision, security, and bureaucratic oversight, were automatically deducted from a nominal base salary. These deductions consistently reduced the actual amount received to less than 10% of the total revenue generated by each woman's labor. Invisible chains, forced recruitment, and mass transfers. The large-scale mobilization of women to sustain the comfort station system demanded the creation of a continent-wide operational network functioning as a direct extension of the Japanese state apparatus. This machinery of forced recruitment merged military institutions, colonial administrations, intelligence agencies, and civilian intermediaries into an industrial-scale operation guided by documented procedures, established transit routes, and numerical targets that were systematically reviewed and adjusted according to wartime needs. Formalized mass recruitment began in the mid-1930s, when the rapid expansion of the system far exceeded the capacity of existing prostitution circuits in Japan and its occupied territories. The Ministry of the Army issued an official directive authorizing designated contractors to organize and oversee the mass relocation of women from areas under Japanese control or influence. This order, officially titled Guidelines for the Provision of Supplementary Services, created a legal facade for operations that in practice relied overwhelmingly on coercion, deception, and the exploitation of deep social and economic vulnerabilities. Recruitment agreements served as the administrative front designed to provide an appearance of legitimacy to mass capture campaigns. These documents, presented as authentic labor contracts, promised paid employment in munitions factories, military hospitals, or army-run restaurants in occupied regions. However, internal documents later uncovered revealed that these contracts were deliberately ambiguous. They lacked specifics about working conditions, schedules, actual job sites, or provisions for communication with families. In most recorded cases, the contracts were signed under direct pressure or outright deception about the true nature of the work. Recruitment strategies varied depending on territory and local conditions. In impoverished rural areas, particularly Korea and the poorest provinces of China, agents preyed on the desperation of peasant families, offering wages that appeared to guarantee not only survival, but also an improvement in living standards for dependents. Promises often included education for siblings, medical treatment for ill relatives, or upgrades to farmland and housing. In urban centers, recruitment employed more overtly coercive measures. Arbitrary arrests were made under fabricated charges such as vagrancy, unlicensed prostitution, lacking proper family papers, or supposed links to anti-Japanese activity. These arrests were executed by local Kempeitai units or auxiliary police trained to target women fitting pre-established criteria: age, physical health, appearance, and absence of strong family or social ties that could spark investigation. The Japanese colonial police in Korea and Taiwan played a central role in these operations. The Social Control Department in Keijo, Seoul, maintained exhaustive records of women considered socially or economically vulnerable. These files served as selection catalogs for recruitment drives, containing personal data such as names, ages, family composition, financial status, education, social networks, and even estimated likelihood of resisting or reporting if abducted. Once chosen, the women were officially handed over to transport and training companies, administrative fronts entirely controlled by the Imperial Army. These entities provided bureaucratic cover, allowing mass transfers to proceed without arousing suspicion among civilians or drawing international attention. In occupied regions such as the Philippines, Burma, Indonesia, and Malaya, operations were directed through the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, which coordinated sophisticated intelligence networks of local collaborators. These collaborators included former colonial officials, merchants dependent on Japanese patronage, and organized crime figures who cooperated in exchange for protection or financial reward. Their role was to pinpoint rural communities with high structural vulnerability, villages devastated by war, areas stripped of men through conscription or executions, regions with minimal Japanese garrison presence and weak resistance, and communities with cultural norms that facilitated obedience to external authority or the subjugation of women to familial decisions. The systematic co-optation of local leaders was vital for the machinery to function. In Korea, village heads and district officials were ordered to convene community gatherings where supposed job opportunities were advertised. Backed by official-looking documents, these promises were entirely false. Families were cornered by a calculated mix of enticing financial incentives and implicit, or at times direct, threats of the consequences of refusing Japanese authority or being labeled uncooperative with the imperial war effort. Civilian intermediaries and the machinery of transfer. Civilian intermediaries functioned as the essential operational bridge between centralized military authorities and scattered local communities. These agents, often recruited from marginalized or criminal elements of society, maintained detailed, constantly updated registries that included full names, exact ages, family circumstances, evaluations of physical appearance, and crucially, estimates of the potential physical or psychological endurance of each woman marked as a target. Such lists were systematically forwarded to regional military offices for formal authorization, following a rigid hierarchical chain that extended upward from local branches to zone commands. The China Expeditionary Army, the Southern Forces, the Guangdong Army, and other principal commands overseeing different theaters of war. Centralized control guaranteed efficient coordination, prevented duplication, and allowed deployment to be adjusted in line with fluctuating demands for women in specific operational areas. In numerous well-documented cases, underage girls were deliberately registered as adults to meet the system's formal requirements for minimum age in sensitive facilities. This large-scale falsification of records was overseen by specialized military administrative offices and carried out by trained clerks skilled in forgery and the handling of official documentation. Transport as military logistics. The transfer of women to their destinations was organized as a fully standardized military logistical operation, directed by the Army's Transportation Division. Special military trains and requisitioned civilian vessels, placed under strict Imperial Navy supervision, formed the backbone of these routes. Each convoy was guarded by Kempeitai personnel, and on longer journeys, sometimes lasting weeks, military doctors were present to monitor the physical condition of the human cargo, which often endured overcrowding, malnutrition, and exposure to disease. Women were grouped by nationality and assigned destination, stripped of their names, and given identification numbers that replaced personal identity throughout the journey. This coding system effectively erased individuality and ensured complete control, blocking communication, recognition, or appeals for help. Records were checked at every checkpoint, and the entire transport procedure was meticulously designed to eliminate escape, resistance, or contact with the outside world. Routes of the continental system. Permanent logistical corridors were established to connect recruitment centers with operational zones. From Korea, the primary route began at the port of Busan, crossed to Shimonoseki on the Japanese mainland, continued by rail to Hiroshima for additional processing, and then extended by sea to Southeast Asia, particularly the Philippines, Indonesia, and Burma. From Taiwan, large convoys departed the port of Keelung bound for Nagasaki, where women were redistributed to locations such as the Philippines, urban garrisons, Borneo, resource extraction sites, and the Dutch East Indies, expansion bases in the Indonesian archipelago. The continental transportation system also relied heavily on the Japanese railway grid, as well as newly built railways in occupied territories designed specifically for military purposes. Special trains departed regularly from processing hubs in Nanjing, Qingdao, and Beijing to strategic ports like Dalian and Qingdao, for where the women were shipped to Pacific outposts, including Rabaul, Truk, and bases throughout the central and western island chains. Between 1937 and 1944, over 500 officially documented mass transfers were conducted solely for the comfort station system, with convoys typically carrying 200 to 400 women, depending on capacity and operational demand. The peak year was 1942, when an estimated 80,000 individual journeys were recorded from Korea and Manchuria alone to military zones in Southeast Asia and the Pacific. Military criteria for final assignment. The final distribution of women followed strict logistical criteria devised by military planners. Demand in specific theaters of operation dictated allocation, with high concentration areas receiving continuous reinforcements in coordination with troop rotations. Operational risk levels influence the type of women deployed. The youngest and most physically resilient were usually assigned to rear bases where demand was sustained and intensive, while older or more experienced women were often sent to frontline stations or mobile facilities in combat zones, where conditions were harsher but usage was somewhat less constant. Ethnic and linguistic factors also shaped deployment policy. Assignments sought to maximize control and minimize the risk of escape or organized resistance. Women capable of speaking local languages were deliberately stationed in occupied regions to facilitate control, prevent misunderstandings, and ensure smoother integration into the occupying system. Regional assignments and ethnic deployment. Korean women were most often stationed in Korea or Manchuria, where their knowledge of local languages and customs made them easier to control. Chinese women generally remained in mainland China, where their familiarity with the environment allowed them to be used more effectively. Women from the Philippines, Indonesia, and other Southeast Asian regions were typically kept within their own territories, where their understanding of local languages and geography made them particularly useful for Japanese operations. Bureaucracy of abuse. The state as administrator of the body. The comfort women system functioned as a fully integrated administrative branch of the Japanese state, coordinated across multiple ministries and sustained by specialized bureaucratic mechanisms that treated mass sexual enslavement as a routine governmental duty. Its deep institutionalization within the state structure demonstrates beyond doubt that it was not an isolated or secret aberration of wartime misconduct, but rather an official policy executed with the same meticulous organization that characterized other core state functions during the conflict. Interministerial coordination was maintained through systematic correspondence between the Ministry of the Army, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and the Ministry of Health, each carrying distinct responsibilities. The Ministry of the Army oversaw logistics, security of the facilities, troop transportation, and coordination with military units making use of the system. The Ministry of Health established medical protocols, ensured the supply of medicines and equipment, and supervised the training of specialized doctors assigned to the stations. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs provided diplomatic cover in occupied territories, mediated with local colonial administrations, and worked with intelligence agencies to suppress potential resistance or foreign exposure. Regular coordination meetings between ministerial delegates were held monthly and documented with complete records, attendance lists, agendas, adopted resolutions, timelines for enforcement, and follow-up responsibilities. Each ministry appointed permanent senior officials tasked exclusively with overseeing policies tied to the system, thereby creating a standing bureaucratic structure dedicated to the organized management of institutionalized sexual exploitation. Military oversight and logistical orders. Operational directives for comfort stations were regularly issued by the major regional commands, such as the China Expeditionary Army, the Southern Forces in Southeast Asia, and the Guangdong Army in Manchuria. These commands determined the scale of facilities under their authority, the number of women required, detailed management procedures, and personnel rotation schedules designed to maximize system efficiency. Orders were updated at least monthly, especially in areas with shifting troop deployments caused by active combat, unit rotations, or tactical changes. Each document included technical annexes containing personnel allocation tables, identification codes for each station, quantitative performance benchmarks, and reporting frameworks that allowed centralized monitoring of compliance. Women were reduced in official records to serial numbers and functional categories, effectively classified as specialized equipment within the Imperial Army's overall resource management system. This systematic depersonalization allowed bureaucrats to process them with the same detachment applied to any other logistical resource. Auditing and economic management. Comfort stations were subjected to the same rigorous audit procedures as any other military logistics unit. Specialized inspectors trained in Army accounting carried out quarterly reviews, which included complete checks of financial records, verification of food and medical stockpiles against consumption, quantitative evaluation of service hours rendered during the period, compliance reviews with health regulations mandated by the Ministry of Health. Audit reports were consolidated at regional administrative offices and then forwarded to Central Command. For example, in 1942, 63 stations in occupied China underwent simultaneous audits, each producing detailed reports listing the auditor's name and rank, performance comparisons against benchmarks, cost analyses, and recommendations for improving efficiency. The outcomes of these inspections directly shaped policy. Underperforming facilities were shut down, efficient stations were expanded, personnel were redeployed to optimize usage, and operational protocols were revised to maximize productivity. Financial formalization. The system was managed according to strict financial and efficiency principles, comparable to state enterprises or military-industrial units. Payrolls for women were formally recorded by the Army's accounting branch under protocols used for civilian staff employed by the military. Although the wages assigned were deliberately meager, their systematic recording in official ledgers served to mask slavery as legitimate employment, granting the operation a facade of legality. Standardized deductions were automatically applied to nominal wages, such as living costs, calculated using inflated official tables, ensuring that the actual amount retained was negligible. Financial deductions and economic control. Medical costs, including both treatment of illnesses and compulsory preventive examinations, were routinely deducted. Transportation expenses from the women's places of origin were retroactively charged to them, without consent or knowledge. An additional broad and intentionally vague category labeled administrative services encompassed oversight, security, bureaucratic management, and other general operating costs. These systematic deductions reduced the women's actual earnings to a token fraction, often less than 5% of the total income they generated. In documented cases, periodic bank transfers were made to families, primarily in Korea and Taiwan. Such transactions required approval from mid-level administrators and strict verification of recipients through official identification. Oversight included censorship of outgoing and incoming correspondence, examination of postal addresses to confirm family details, and periodic home visits by colonial agents to ensure funds were received and used as expected. The bank accounts tied to the system were deliberately coded with numerical identifiers that concealed the beneficiaries' real names. They were linked solely to military financial institutions, such as the Military Bank of Japan or specially authorized branches of a Yokohama specie bank. This financial architecture provided bureaucratic legitimacy while ensuring complete state control over every transaction, enabling constant monitoring of money flows and swift detection of irregularities or unauthorized communication. Medical and administrative integration. Each station had permanently assigned medical and administrative personnel who were formal members of the military hierarchy, with defined ranks, duties, and chains of command. Alongside physicians trained in tropical medicine and venereal diseases, and nurses trained in basic gynecological care, stations employed health inspectors tasked with verifying hygiene compliance, military pharmacists responsible for managing drug supplies, quartermaster aides overseeing logistics, military clerks specializing in medical and administrative documentation. These staff were required to produce detailed, regular reports systematically forwarded to the Army Health Department. Reports covered the number of examinations conducted, treatments administered and their effectiveness, infection detection with trend analysis, availability of essential drugs, replenishment requests, and assessments of the women's health with projections of future capacity. Medical records followed standardized formats established by the Army Medical Department and were directly integrated into the Military Medical Information System, treating women's health as part of preventive military medicine. Facilities were inspected every 30 to 45 days by traveling medical officers who verified compliance with protocols and assessed the effectiveness of preventive measures. Field reports included quantitative efficiency evaluations, behavioral assessments of the women, and recommendations for optimizing operations. These documents measured factors such as service frequency, average service duration, percentage of preventive methods used, women's disciplinary records, and attitudes towards supervisors, with guidance for handling problematic individuals. Systematic evidence destruction. Japan's unconditional surrender on August 15, 1945, triggered one of the most systematic cover-up operations in modern history. Within hours, the High Command initiated a prearranged program of mass evidence destruction to erase all documentary traces of the Comfort Women's system before Allied forces could access archives. This was not a spontaneous reaction to defeat, but the execution of a contingency plan designed to shield the Japanese state from legal, political, and diplomatic consequences. On August 18, 1945, just 72 hours after surrender, the Imperial General Staff issued top priority orders to all military units abroad and within Japan to destroy records. Standardized methods ensured thorough elimination. Incineration in metal drums, shredding of sensitive documents, and dumping archives into rivers, canals, or ports. Senior officers directly supervised destruction, certifying compliance and reporting completion up the chain of command. The operation was so organized that later SCAP investigators estimated that over 90% of all records tied to the system disappeared within 3 weeks of surrender. Surviving records and Allied recoveries. Despite the thoroughness, destruction was incomplete due to the speed of Allied advances in certain theaters. American, Australian, and British troops occupied Japanese facilities before documentation could be fully destroyed. Rabaul, Papua New Guinea. Australian soldiers recovered rosters of women's rotations, accounting ledgers, and railway orders, providing undeniable evidence of the system's military organization. Saigon, British troops seized operational manuals detailing medical inspections, shift systems, disciplinary codes, and command structures. Korea, Seoul, SCAP forces found recruitment records, contractor lists, front company details, and banking document from the Yokohama Specie Bank proving state funding and fiscal integration. These archives were preserved and transferred to Allied documentation centers, now housed in institutions such as the U.S. National Archives, the Australian War Memorial, and British military collections, forming the backbone of post-war historical research on the system. Erasure of identities. Alongside document destruction, the High Command executed equally systematic efforts to obscure the identities of survivors and civilian collaborators. Many women were coerced into adopting new identities via falsified documents. Others were registered as repatriates without official records at ports, such as Majiko and Maizuru, where mass returns of civilians and troops from occupied territories were processed. This procedure had a dual objective: to eliminate any bureaucratic trace of the women's involvement in the system, and to obstruct future investigations or legal claims by making it nearly impossible to identify individual victims or reconstruct personal cases of exploitation. The deliberate fabrication of documentary confusion around identities was a calculated strategy designed to prevent the emergence of evidence usable in legal proceedings. In territories such as the Philippines and Indonesia, confidential SCAP reports recorded numerous clandestine repatriations carried out through unofficial naval routes that bypassed Allied checkpoints. Japanese officers who remained in occupied areas after surrender secretly boarded women onto logistical convoys ostensibly assigned for troop repatriation, but in reality used as covert evacuation channels intended to remove potential witnesses. The silencing of witnesses also extended to far more drastic measures. British intelligence reports from 1946 document multiple cases of extrajudicial executions targeting mid-level personnel directly involved in the system. Clerks who processed recruitment files, civilian physicians who conducted examinations, and local collaborators with detailed operational knowledge. In Burma and Malaya, British agents documented the systematic disappearance of civilians who had aided in recruitment and transport. These eliminations were carried out by former Japanese officers working in small, compartmentalized cells to erase trails that could expose senior figures of the regime to future liability. Diplomatic cover-up. Japanese diplomatic missions in Southeast Asia received explicit instructions from the Foreign Ministry to categorically deny government involvement, portraying the brothels as private initiatives of civilian entrepreneurs. Embassies and consulates in Jakarta, Manila, Rangoon, and Bangkok destroyed visa ledgers, employment contracts, and immigration files that could link the Japanese state to the transport of women into military zones. Surviving telegrams confirm that consular staff were instructed to restrict Allied researchers' access to migration records and to close entire archive sections in anticipation of SCAP inspections. Some missions even suspended operations, citing war damage, to block investigations during the critical post-surrender months. The cover-up also relied on financial mechanisms. Reserved funds from the military treasury were diverted into a program officially labeled the Complementary Operations Termination Budget. This financed one-time payments to civilian intermediaries, accelerated liquidation of front company contracts, and special compensations to officers to secure their silence. Surviving records show at least 12 large transfers in late 1945 to private accounts in Osaka and Kobe used by contractors who had operated in Korea and China. Significant sums were also paid to shipping firms that had run transport routes from Formosa and Manchuria, effectively buying their non-cooperation in future inquiries. Manufactured impunity after the war. The impunity of the comfort women system was not born from ignorance or from gaps in post-war international law. It was the result of deliberate political choices, especially by the United States. The International Military Tribunal for the Far East, IMTFE, had legal categories broad enough to prosecute the system as slavery, forced deportation, or crimes against humanity. Yet prosecutors deliberately excluded it. While sexual crimes like the Nanjing Massacre were addressed, they were framed as isolated atrocities rather than as manifestations of official state policy. The comfort women system, despite its systematic, bureaucratic nature, was ignored. Declassified documents later revealed prosecutors had considered including the crimes, but dismissed them for political reasons. In reality, Cold War imperatives took priority. The U.S. sought to rebuild Japan rapidly as an ally against communism, which meant preserving much of its bureaucracy and shielding many of those who had overseen the system. Key officials were protected from extradition to South Korea or the Philippines, some even recruited as intelligence assets in exchange for immunity. Diplomatic records show negotiations in which suppression of the issue was traded for Japan's cooperation in military and strategic matters. Post-war legal structures blocking justice. After sovereignty was restored in 1951, Japan's domestic legal framework reinforced this impunity. The Veterans Compensation Law deliberately excluded enslaved women, while revisions to the Civil Code barred lawsuits for acts committed before 1945. Japanese courts routinely rejected claims, citing bilateral treaties, such as the 1965 Normalization Treaty with South Korea, that supposedly resolved the matter, despite being signed under pressure and without full disclosure of information about the system. This created a closed loop. Without legal recognition, lawsuits failed. Without lawsuits, no precedents were set. Controlled recognition in the late 20th century. In the 1990s, declassified files finally exposed the scope of the cover-up. SCAP documents showed deliberate omissions of victim and perpetrator lists and records confirming the political risks of prosecuting the crimes. Some administrators of the system had even reappeared under new identities in prominent government and corporate roles. Facing international criticism, Japan adopted a strategy of partial acknowledgement. In 1992, it conceded the existence of a system but avoided the term sexual slavery, preferring euphemisms like improper recruitment. In 1995, the Asian Women's Fund was created 1995 to 2001, financed by private donations rather than state reparations, and framed as humanitarian aid rather than legal responsibility. Victims groups largely rejected it as a maneuver to evade accountability. Subsequent treaties with the Philippines, Indonesia, Taiwan, and the Netherlands included explicit clauses waiving future claims. Compensation was symbolic and always framed as gestures of goodwill. Not admissions of state crimes. Conclusion: impunity as policy. The comfort women's system's impunity was not accidental. It was the product of a coordinated strategy combining geopolitical priorities, restrictive legal maneuvers, financial silencing, and bureaucratic erasure. In protecting the post-war international order, the rights of the victims were sacrificed. What resulted was one of the most sustained cover-ups of systematic crime in the 20th century.